I just wanted to say that tonight's program was a joint effort between QHS, the Friends of the Quaney Grange, and the Charlestown Historical Society. And many thanks to Pam Lyons, who's here, wearing a hat, and Ann Bettinger, who's... Ann Bettinger, I believe, is not here because she's preparing the feast that you'll have downstairs after the program. So a few announcements, obviously, silence your cell phones, the emergency exit, just be aware of them. And as I said, after the program, please join us downstairs for some snacks from with food prepared from the era. That's what Ann Bettinger has been telling us that she's been doing all day. So I was going to introduce our speaker tonight, but when I saw how our archivist dressed for the occasion, I just said wear a tri-corner hat, and Bill had this really good outfit. I'm not quite sure, what did you say you were? I thought he was the town crier, but I think he is a Lord gentleman. But anyway, he's going to introduce Christian McBurney.
He looks like a Tory to me.
Does it show?
Pretty elegant.
Excuse me, you speaker.
Oh, I can project my voice.
Okay.
All right, well, I'll hold this device, which appears to emit light. It must use electricity, like my friend Franklin. Well, as you know, my name is Bill Steinman. I am the archivist of this fine organization, and I am also a citizen farmer of this good colony, soon to be an independent state. It is absolutely my pleasure to welcome back Christian McBurney. Christian McBurney previously spoke to QHS about Rhode Island in the Second World War. Christian is also, like myself, a recovered and retired former Washington, D.C. lawyer. So we have that in common. It's much better on this side than the other. More importantly, Christian is the author of 11 books, 6 on the American Revolution and 5 on the great state of Rhode Island. By the way, many of his books, if not all of them, are here for you to see. His books include The Rhode Island Campaign, the first French and American operation in the Revolutionary War, and Dark Voyage, an American privateer's war on Great Britain's African slave trade. That sounds marvelous. His next book is on the famous Black Regiment of Rhode Island, which fought during the Revolutionary War. Christian is also the founder and publisher of the leading Rhode Island history blog, smallstatebighistory.com. If you haven't been to it yet, go look it up, read it regularly. This state is small but so filled with fascinating history from its pre-colonial and colonial days to today. I encourage all of you to visit it, and Christian is a marvelous head and contributor, and I have enjoyed his work for many years. He is also president of the George Washington American Revolution Roundtable in Washington, D.C. He resides with his wife in Kensington, Maryland, and they have a second home here in Little Rhode Island in West Kensington. Christian, thank you so much. Oh, and he did ask me to say, as Joan said, we are having microphone problems, and not everyone is blessed or cursed with this very loud voice that I have. So I ask all of you, in the spirit of our founding fathers and mothers, to lend an ear, listen very intently to a voice that is not projected, and if we're all quiet and we all lean forward, we'll be able to hear every single word that Christian says. Chris, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Bill. I can do a little better than that, but thank you. How many of you already have read articles on Small State Big History, my website? Raise your hand. So quite a few. So I have 2,750 sign-ups of Rhode Island history lovers, and if you'd like to be one of them, you can put your name and your email address, write neatly. I miss about 10%, but and I'll send you one email a week that has the article. That's all, one email a week with the article. So By the way, thank you all for what a great showing, and you guys care about our 250th anniversary, the summer of that anniversary. I'm not going to say sesquicentennial, whatever. I called it the 250th anniversary, so I'll circulate this around. I always get the pen back, so that's good. Yeah. All right, Rhode Island's role in the American Revolution from 1775 to 1783 is wide-ranging and complicated, and it's another example of Rhode Island's a small state and yet has such a large history. My lecture is intended to focus on what happened in Rhode Island during the Revolutionary War, not famous Rhode Islanders or regiments acting outside of Rhode Island. I'm also not going to talk about the Gaspee affair or other events leading up to the Revolution. You know, this is already a long enough lecture, so it's going to be what happened during the Revolutionary War in Rhode Island. Here's a map of Rhode Island. Everyone knows what that is, Charlestown. South Kingstown in those days included Narragansett. One more. One more. Yeah, I think I missed something, but that's okay. Go back to the map. So I'm going to break it down into 4 stages to try to make it a little bit simple. The war begins with Captain James Wallace. He terrorizes Narragansett Bay from 1775 to 76. There's a privateering rage. Privateers in Rhode Island capturing enemy ships. The British occupy Newport for 3 years, from December 1776 to October 1779. And then the French occupy Rhode Island, Newport from July 1780 to August 1781. Now, war broke out at the battles of Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts on April 19th, 1775. Then you had the Battle of Bunker Hill, June 17th. The British suffered terrible casualties, even though they were able to push the Americans off Breed's Hill. Patriot forces, including some Rhode Island soldiers, then rushed to Boston to set siege to Boston. The British soldiers, are trapped inside of Boston. Rhode Island's newly elected governor, this is Joseph Wanton. He's a wealthy Newport merchant, and he's a Tory. Ooh. He refuses to sign the commissions of officers who are of the regiments who were supposed to go to Boston. So this enraged patriots, and patriots were by far the dominant party in Rhode Island. Sometimes you hear Revolutionary War, 1/3 patriots, 1/3 loyalists, 1/3 neutral. Not true in Rhode Island. It's more like 65% patriots, 15% Tories, and 30% neutral, something more like that. And the patriots control the government. So what they do with this governor, they ignored him. They just operated the government without him. Finally, they deposed him and elected a new governor, Nicholas Cook, in November 1775. So it's pretty extraordinary. Now, once war broke out in April 1775, they realized, hey, we've got this General Assembly. It only meets a couple times a year. Maybe we can make it 3 or 4 times now, but that's not enough to run a war. So they created this new organization called the Council of War. It had 10 members, and it could make decisions on getting supplies and appointing officers and that kind of thing. The smallest colony, Rhode Island, had a population of 60,000. And it did quickly respond to the Battle of Bunker Hill by sending a brigade of 3 regiments and some artillery under Nathaniel Greene. And most of these troops were eventually incorporated into newly established Continental regiments who were under the control of Congress and George Washington. Thank you, George. Despite being a military novice, Greene suddenly becomes a favorite of Washington. He did a really good job keeping the regiments in good order, and the tents are all properly set up, and the regimental uniforms were looking good. Washington was impressed, and in council meetings, he was even more impressed with Washington. And Greene becomes really the number 2 guy. Washington even said if he was killed, Greene should take over, and probably the best commander on either side of the war. We also have on the, go back to the right, that's James Varnum of East Greenwich, also a significant general. Now, late in 1774, the British sent the 24-gun HMS Rose under Captain James Wallace to patrol Narragansett Bay to try to enforce British tax and maritime laws. Here's a replica of the HMS Rose. I actually was on it. John Millar of Newport helped to finance it, and it's been in several movies, including, what's that guy's name? The pirate?
Oh, Johnny Depp. Captain.
Jack Sparrow, yeah, all those. Pirates of the Caribbean. That's the ship they use. But a nice ship. So the first stage of the war commenced, when war broke out at Lexington and Concord, April 1775. Suddenly, Wallace starts spreading terror among the coastal residents of Rhode Island. His men torched houses on Jamestown, killing 1 resident. They bombarded Bristol because Bristol wouldn't give them any sheep, food. A minister died of a heart attack. They threatened to destroy Newport several times, and they mounted raids to take livestock on farms on Point Judith, North Kingstown, and Prudence Island. And at Prudence Island, some Rhode Island militia were sent there, and they did an ambush, and there was a pitched battle between the Rhode Island militia and Wallace's soldiers and sailors, and several were killed on each side. Wallace even captured Providence merchant John Brown and accused him accurately of being an organizer of the Gaspee affair. But Brown was able to gain his release thanks to his brother Moses' intervention. Finally, Wallace departed Narragansett Bay in April of 1776. Now we go to the second stage, privateering. It was really the most effective weapon that the Americans had at sea, was privateering. These are private ships who go out and seek enemy ships, merchant ships. And if they capture the merchant ship, the investors get 50, they take it back to Providence. There's an admiralty proceeding. Then there's an auction where everything is sold. And then the investors, like John Brown, get 50%, and the officers and crew get the other 50%. And the Continental Navy just wasn't very strong in that time. So privateering began in January 1776. Rhode Island finally enacted its own privateer law and allowing it in March 1776. There is some similarity between piracy and privateering, but privateering, the law is enacted by the state, so that gives it the official imprimatur. But you also had to, you couldn't just take everything and plunder it. You had to bring it back. It had to go through a trial. The trial had to say, yes, it was properly taken from an enemy ship. Sometimes they took cargo and ships from allies, so that they lost those cases when they were brought back. So Providence, and here's a privateer ship attacking a British merchant ship. So those are popular targets. Mostly Providence and Newport merchants, as well as smaller coastal harbors, made the transition from being merchants to being privateers, hiring the former crews as privateersmen. And they were spectacularly successful in 1776, hauling in large British merchant ships from the Caribbean, supply ships, military supply ships going to Canada, Halifax. And this was before the Royal Navy did a good job protecting those vessels. So John Howland, who later became the first president of the Rhode Island Historical Society when he was a young man, returned to Providence in early 1777 after grueling service as in a Rhode Island, as a private in a Rhode Island regiment with Washington's army. He recalled, quote, "The year 1776 was mostly employed in privateering, and many whom I had left in poor circumstances were now rich men." Oh! Howland recalled that the wharves in Providence were lined 2 or 3 deep with the largest ships from Jamaica. Now, Brown had a small privateer, the sloop Diamond, which cost him to outfit and purchase 3,000 pounds. And it was a small ship. It was a sloop, and it had 6 cannon and a crew of 40. Pretty small. But it captured an astounding 12 vessels on 2 voyages. And 3 of them, weighing 200 tons each, and their cargoes were brought into Providence and subject to Admiralty Court procedures. And on the average, the cargoes in the ships sold for each one 9,000 pounds. In $26, the total haul was in US dollars today, that's $5 million. So it's just amazing. And that was just 3 of maybe 40 to 50 that were brought in. With a single capture, John Brown and his fellow investors recouped all their money, the 3,000 pounds. And the second and third captures were all profit. So that's a picture of John Brown and an image of one of his privateers. I'm going to get to that in a minute. The first commander-in-chief of the Continental Navy was Esek Hopkins. He was later fired by the Continental Congress. He was from Providence. And then Continental Navy War's greatest hero, John Paul Jones, he was in Newport at this time. They both decried the fact that the privateersmen were sailors were joining the privateer boats and not the Continental Navy because they couldn't pay as much. Now, my recent book, Dark Voyage, An American Privateer's War on Great Britain's Slave Trade, it was really John Brown's privateer from Providence, is a fascinating story of the Rhode Island privateer Marlborough that in late 1777 and 1778 sailed from Rhode Island to the coast of Africa and attacked British slave ships and British slave forts. At the time, Britain was the world's leading slave trading country. It wasn't even close. So it was a very ambitious and novel for Brown to do that. He did it because he knew about slave trading. He invested in 2 slave trading voyages before the war. Now, I also talk about in the book that the American privateers in total captured so many of these African slave trading ships that the investors in England stopped investing in them. So, and I estimate about 60,000 African captives were not brought over to America, mostly the Caribbean, because of that. On the other hand, what do you do if you're a privateer? You sell the property that you capture. So they were selling these African captives to French plantation owners. So that's the ugly side of privateering. So it's a real groundbreaking book that tells a unique Revolutionary War story. Most of the crew were also from North Kingstown, Exeter, and other Rhode Island towns. As the war proceeded, the Royal Navy did a much better job of protecting their merchant ships and their military supply ships. They started capturing a lot of these privateers. And if you were captured, you were thrown in terrible prisons. The ones in New York City were very deadly. They put in all these people, cram them in, they hardly have any air. One person's sick, it suddenly spreads everywhere. The food isn't very good, so their natural defenses are down. So more people died, actually, way more people died in prison than they did on the battlefield. Newport also had some prison ships. I talked about that in an article I did. And there were times where the death rate spiked there too. A Continental Navy hero from Exeter and South Kingstown, John Peck Rathburn, he was captured and he died in English jail in 1782. This is a pretty effective image by drawing by John Trumbull in the Yale Art Gallery of a prison ship. All right, the third category, and probably the most important one for Rhode Island during the Revolution, was when the British occupied Newport. In the early part of the war, Rhode Island didn't experience much of the war directly, but that changed dramatically on December 7th, 1776. On December 8th, with a fleet of 71 ships and 7,100 soldiers on board, the British seized Newport without difficulty. So here's a nice color image in about early 1900s of the British in Narragansett Bay. You can see the small boats sending British soldiers. So Lord Richard Howe, the Americans just didn't have any troops at that time to defend Newport, so they easily took it. And Lord Richard Howe was the commander of the fleet, and he wanted an ice-free port in Newport. The where his ships could spend the winter. General William Howe, his brother, commander of British forces in North America, wanted a possible striking force for his army that could attack Providence and then recapture Boston. But the problem was he never got enough reinforcements from London, so he could never have enough soldiers in Newport to go on the offensive. So his thousands of troops did nothing there for 3 years. The British Army, led by Major Henry Clinton, captured not only Newport, but also Connecticut Island, Jamestown, because from Jamestown you could fire cannon into Newport. Clinton decided whether to attack Providence, but the weather turned cold and he decided not to. So that was lucky for the survival of the old buildings in Newport. So the rest of Rhode Island, about 3/4 of it, is still held by the Patriots. They really surround Aquidneck Island and Jamestown Island, and there's a real face-off. That's a picture of Newport. Newport at the time was the 5th largest port in the colonial times. You have Philadelphia, Boston, New York, Charlestown, and then Newport. Providence's Esek Hopkins commanded the new Continental Navy, and he had 5 warships in Providence, bottled up in the home port. He had plenty of warning that the British ships were coming, as you'll see, but he chose to keep them in Providence. Probably he wanted to protect Providence, his hometown, but it wasn't a real great idea. Still, in the next year, there was dark and stormy nights. Well, of course, the British had a, what do you call it? You put ships in the bay and you bottle them up. It's a blockade, So they blockaded Narragansett Bay. They had about 3 or 4 ships in each of the 3 channels. But on dark and stormy nights, the American ships could get out, and some of these continental ships were able to get out. One of them, however, was chased onto a beach on Point Judith, and there was a pretty big battle, and finally that ship was burned. But they managed to save the cannon and the rigging and the like. Rhode Island had 3 Continental Navy captains, Abraham Whipple, John Peck Rathburn, and Silas Talbot. Talbot later commanded the U.S. Constitution. Now, in response to the British invasion, the General Assembly in Rhode Island created 3 new state regiments to guard the mainland and required soldiers to enlist for 16 months. And there were 2 state infantry regiments and 1 state artillery regiment. So these would stay in Rhode Island. Continental regiments would be sent, and they were having battles in Philadelphia and all over the place. It's time to mention 2 local prominent patriots, Joseph Stanton Jr. and Joseph Noyes. Stanton was born and inherited what is now known as the Wilcox Tavern on Route 1 on Charleston. I'm sure you've all seen it from Charleston. It's now a coffee and alcohol place and a yoga place. They have nice live music there occasionally. Joseph Noyes had his house in Westerly and Weekapaug. In December 1776, Stanton was appointed by the General Assembly to serve as one of the colonels of these 2 new Rhode Island state regiments that I talked about. Noyes was appointed to be a colonel of the Kings County Militia. Kings County is what Washington County is today. There was something called Spencer's Expedition in 1777. Stanton and Noyes served in these roles as colonels. They all of them marched their troops from Charleston, from Kings County, and they went up to Providence, went down to Tiverton, but they were expecting to invade Aquidneck Island, but it didn't happen. There's also a Captain Amos Green. He was commander of a company of Charlestown militia from 1775 to 1779. He was in the Battle of Rhode Island, the Spencer's Expedition, and other. They also militia would patrol the coast, making sure that the British wouldn't invade. So if you were, an ordinary farmer, second, third son, you would have known Amos Green pretty well because you might have been drafted into his company. One important role that each of Stanton and Noyes performed was to provide intelligence to the Rhode Island governor, Nicholas Cook, of the approaching British fleet in early December 1776. From the perches of southern Charlestown and the westerly coast, they had great vistas to see the mass of the Royal Navy ships sailing from Long Island Sound and approaching Newport. Here you have letters from Colonel Stanton and Colonel Noyes. dated December 2nd, 3rd. Remember, the British finally arrived there December 7th and invaded December 8th in Narragansett Bay. But both of them are telling the governor, hey, we have intelligence from our spies that the British are massing lots of ships and they're probably heading to Newport. These are the key letters here. Stanton's letter, December 7th. He said there's a fleet of 70 sail on this side of Watch Hill, so he's seen it with his own eyes. And he was correct, there were actually 71. And the lead warship is now at Point Judith, so and he said something like, God bless us all. And Noyes, December 6th, he also found out about the ships approaching as well and sent it to the governor. Now the British have taken Newport, and this is just kind of an ordinary letter that you would find. These are at the Rhode Island State Archives, by the way. Two British deserters came off Aquidneck Island from the British Army, and they were going to be sent to Providence, and they're just alerting him from Tower Hill that they're going to send those deserters. So that's the kind of thing they would do. American forces did score a few naval successes, mainly due to Royal Navy mistakes. The 32-gun frigate HMS Diamond accidentally grounded itself off of Warwick in January 1777. Local militia brought up an artillery piece and started firing at it, but due to poor shooting and a lack of aggressiveness by Easton Hopkins and a rising tide, the Diamond escaped being captured and sunk. But it did have about 6 holes in it in the hull, so that was good. It did have to be fixed. On November 6, 1777, in rough weather, the 28-gun HMS Siren ran aground off of Whale Rock on the Narragansett shoreline. It was really a fierce rainstorm and very windy. He's going up Narragansett Bay. You got to take a right if you want to go to New York. Well, he took a right a little bit too soon. This time, the local militia brought up 3 artillery pieces that fired accurate shots. The Royal Navy, after several hours, captain surrendered his frigate, allowing the Americans to capture the ship. They got 136 British sailors as captives that could be exchanged for American prisoners held in Newport. British warships patrolling Narragansett Bay often chased Rhode Island vessels whose captains, rather than be caught at sea, if you're caught at sea, you're going to be put in one of these awful jails, right? And they would capture all your cargo. So they would run their vessels onto the beach. So watch out for that next time you're on the beach. And then the sailors could get their the cargo off the ship. They get the sails, they get the rigging off, and then typically the British would send lifeboats and burn the ship. On 2 occasions, the action turned to Watch Hill and Westerly. On August 5th at 5 a.m., a small sloop bound from New Bedford to New London was chased by the British frigate Cerberus and run on the beach in Westerly. The Cerberus anchored within, quote, a musket shot from the shore and fired some of its guns at the beach vessel. On shore, a 9-pound cannon belonging to the Westerly militia was brought forward, and the Cerberus just skedaddled after having a few shots go over it. The small cargo of rice, rum, sugar, and other provisions was saved, and it appears the sloop was saved from destruction as well. On September 22nd, 1777, the British frigate HMS Alternock and a schooner with 14 guns chased a small American privateer sloop in the western part of Long Island Sound. The privateer outsailed the British ships and came to anchor off of Watch Hill, probably considering, hey, we're in this protected area. It's lots of shoals around Watch Hill. They're never going to come here. But the British schooner made the attempt and failed and ran onto a reef of rocks at high tide. On shore, militia from Westerly brought cannon to the site and started firing at the schooner, hulling the enemy schooner several times. The sailors aboard the schooner retreated down below the deck. The Alternock waited till the nighttime, sent some small boats to the schooner, took off the crew, but had to leave the ship, which they set fire to. So for the next 3 years, the General Assembly and this new Council of War passed resolutions to increase the state's defenses against possible raids by the British Army in Newport. And it was always a struggle for the state. You know, their economy was pretty much at a standstill because the British controlled Narragansett Bay and Newport, its biggest town. And so it was tough for the tax, if you were subject to high taxes if you were here in Charlestown or other towns. And so it was a tough time. One of the outstanding events during the British occupation was the brilliant and bold abduction of Major General Richard Prescott, the commander of British troops on Aquidneck Island, by state troops led by Lieutenant Colonel William Barton of Warren and Providence. Barton seized Prescott so Americans could have a British officer of the same rank to exchange for Major General Charles Lee, who was number 2 to Washington. He had been captured by the British in a raid at Basking Ridge, New Jersey in December 1776. So Barton said, hey, we need a Major General so we can exchange the two. So here's Barton, and here's his sword that Congress awarded to him. On the night of July 10, 1777, Barton and his party of 48 men rowed their boats from Warwick Neck through British warships stationed in Narragansett Bay, quietly made their way for 1 mile from the coast to Aquidneck Island, surrounded a farmhouse where Prescott was staying. Why was he staying there? He usually stayed in Newport, but he said, well, there's lots of raids in the northern part of Aquidneck Island. That's where the action is, so I'm going to stay at this farmhouse. Well, that was a mistake. This farmhouse was surrounded, they captured the sentry, snatched Prescott from his bed, returned him to Warwick Neck safely, all without a shot being fired. And as I argued in a book I wrote on this called Kidnapping the Enemy, his raid still stands as one of the most impressive special operations in American military history. Now, I don't know if you've heard of Prescott Farm on West Main Road in Portsmouth, Middletown border. So that's the house right there where he was captured from. You can still see it. And this is supposedly a British guardhouse. In January of 1777, John Adams wrote to his wife Abigail, "The little nest of hornets in Rhode Island," he meant the British Army, "is it to remain unmolested this winter? The honor of New England is concerned. If they are not crushed, I will never again glory in being a New England man." New England made 2 attempts in 1777 to try to dislodge the British out of Newport, but both failed. The second attempt was the more serious one. That was called Spencer's Expedition, named after the commander of the Rhode Island Theater of War for the Americans at that time, Joseph Spencer. It was designed to be a secret expedition. You know, Aquidneck Island is an island, so you need to have a navy to really win Aquidneck Island, and the Americans didn't have that. So they were going to have a secret expedition. They drafted 10,000 men, mostly from Massachusetts and Connecticut, and 3,000 from Rhode Island. Didn't tell them what was going on. They marched to Tiverton and Little Compton, and they were going to cross over onto Aquidneck Island on one night. But for various reasons, it didn't turn out. There was a British spy who found out about it, and he told the British commander at the last minute. There were also some people were firing muskets, and ships were going up and down, so the British got suspicious. So it didn't work out. They had to cancel it. But that's when Charlestown militia, you know, if you were in the militia, you would have marched from here to Providence. You would have gathered and mustered on probably Captain Amos's farm on Route 112. And then you would have marched up to Providence, marched to the east, and then marched down to Tiverton, probably take Slade's Ferry, go into Tiverton and Little Compton. Then you had to march back. Couldn't cross over Narragansett Bay because it was British ships controlled it. So matters really changed when France, Britain's historic enemy, remember they lost the French and Indian War and they were looking for revenge. And when Americans proved at the Battle of Saratoga that they could really fight well, France agreed to enter into an alliance against the British. And that was done in February of 1778. France had been increasing its navy. It had been almost destroyed at the French and Indian War, but they rebuilt it. And they sent over a pretty strong navy towards America. The new British commander-in-chief North America was Henry Clinton. He abandons Philadelphia, even though the British had captured it. It's the capital. But he wants to focus just on 2 cities that the British have, New York City and Newport. Here's the commander of Newport at the time, Robert Pigot. I always thought it was Pigot, a nice French name, but you read the diaries, they're usually phonetic, so it's Pigot, so not very nice. He actually launched a preemptive raid of Bristol and Warren. There were 125 flatboats there. They could have carried soldiers from Little Compton and Tiverton and Bristol onto Aquidneck Island. So he has a raid and he burns most of them. So pretty successful. But he also burned about 19 houses in Bristol and about 10 in Warren, and including 2 churches. And they took 60 prisoners. They just started snatching people from the farm fields. And you're only supposed to take military captives, but he was just taking regular citizens for the most part. About 10 were soldiers. When asked later why he did that, he said, well, they were all subject to the draft. They could all be drafted. It's a fair point. Rhode Island had a draft, each town did it. It was a universal draft. Even if you were a Tory, you had to respond, and if you didn't, you would get fined. But not everyone, that was only from age 16 to 50 for the most part, and some of these, were older or younger. Most of them only spent a month in British jails, but a couple of them spent a long time in New York City prison ships. So on July 29, 1778, a large fleet under Charles Henry Theodat, Count d'Estaing, arrives off Point Judith. Britain's ancient rival France had finally decided to openly support the American cause with a significant military force, and the arrival of d'Estaing's squadrons spread panic among the British and the Loyalists in Newport. Here he is. Not wanting to have their warships at or around Newport, so remember they had these, the blockade in Narragansett Bay. They brought them closer to Aquidneck Island, but even then the French Navy was much stronger than them, so the British, in response, decided to burn each one of their frigates. So that was a big loss. Taken together, a lot of these, they were 28 guns, 32 guns, those were pretty substantial ships. They lost a total of 210 cannon. And that was the biggest loss suffered by the British Navy in the entire Revolutionary War. Now, it wasn't due to battles, but it was the threat of the battle that caused them to do it. So a loss is a loss, I say. British defenders also scuttled 5 or 6 transport ships in between Goat Island and Coasters Harbor Island, and 6 more between Goat Island and Rose Island. They didn't want the French ships to just rush into Newport Harbor, so by sinking these transport ships, the masts are just below the water line. Some of them are a little above. That scared the French from going there. One of them was the Lord Sandwich, which was used as a British ship in Newport Harbor, but it was a very famous ship, one of the most famous in the world actually, named the Endeavour. It had carried Captain James Cook and his crew on its voyage of discovery to Australia and New Zealand from 1768 to 1771. So it was like the Mayflower of Australia. Kathy Abbas led a Rhode Island Marine Archaeological Project, reported that she more likely than not found the ship's remains in Newport Harbor. So meanwhile, the invasion attempt was postponed as the American Army took time to gather a strong force. The Americans had to do a lot of drafting. Massachusetts had to draft militia, Connecticut, Rhode Island. That took time. Plus, Washington's main army was in White Plains at the time. He needed to send his troops marching under Marquis de Lafayette and James Varnum to Rhode Island. The commander of the New England Army in the Rhode Island Theater was sent by George Washington. He was Major John Sullivan of New Hampshire. He was a competent commander, but he could get kind of upset, as we'll see. On August 8th, d'Estaing's fleet forced the main channel of Narragansett Bay amid fierce cannon fire from Newport's defenders. You can see here, this is a French map. I held it in the original in the Library of Congress, and the guy said, "Be careful, it's worth about $3 million." But you can see they made beautiful maps. You could say that about the French. On August 9th, the French were finally preparing to ship their troops to the west side of Aquidneck Island. Sullivan's troop had already crossed over from Tiverton and landed on the northeast side of Aquidneck Island the previous day, and they had marched down to the northern part of Portsmouth and Butts Hill Fort, which is an outstanding surviving fort. Just as d'Estaing was about to issue orders for his men to take their boats, Admiral Richard Howe's fleet arrived unexpectedly from New York City to wreck French and American invasion plans. So d'Estaing had a decision. Should he take his ships out and attack Howe's fleet, or should he stay and help out with the American invasion of Newport and captured Newport first. Arguably, he should have done the latter. That was why he was there. But there were some good reasons not to allow, a major fleet to be hanging off the coast, even if the French fleet was a little stronger. So the next day, the French ships sail out. You can see the British have cannon in Newport. They're firing at each other. There's a tremendous noise. D'Estaing's fleet chases Howe's fleet. Everyone thinks it's going to be a big battle. You can see it from Brenton's Neck. No, Howe turns around and sails south. By doing that, is he being a chicken? Yeah, I suppose. But he's also saving Newport from being overrun. So that was an effective strategy. He was also trying to get what's called the weather gauge. They wanted the wind behind him. And he waited until the next day, and he was gaining the weather gauge. But then suddenly, this big storm crops up, and it turned out to be a hurricane. And it was each ship for itself. Turned out that the French ships were much more damaged than the English ships. Here's the flagship, D'Estaing's flagship, 90 guns, all three masts gone. And the British ship found it and was firing cannonballs in the rear of it, and cannonballs were just rolling up, down the ship. So it looked pretty bad. But night came and the British ship held off. The next morning, the D'Estaing started firing its cannon. Other French ships heard it, came to the rescue. But there were two other ships that had lost two of their three masts. One ship, there were also three single ship battles with the British. So D'Estaing decided that he couldn't go back to Newport and help out with the capture of Newport. He had to go to Boston to refit. He did go back to Boston, told Sullivan in person. Sullivan, unfortunately, got really upset and said, hey, you French, you're abandoning us at their time of need, and you're lousy allies. Not really good when one of the richest countries in the world is offering to help you. Excuse me, I need a little drink. So, see, next, here we go. I'm only aware only two of these prints are in color. I happen to own this one, so. Bought it for $100 on Amazon. Sorry, I'm bragging. But this is not actually the Battle of Rhode Island, as some people think. It was the Siege of Rhode Island. So you see the British tents in the front here, and the British are on the left. They're firing their cannon over there, and they're also striking the Americans on the hill, Bannister's Hill in the distance. So it's American siege lines are coming forward. It was one of the few times in the war that the Americans set siege to the British. Sullivan was aided by troops from George Washington's Main Continental Army, some of its top officers, including Nathaniel Greene and James Varnum. Also, Marquis de Lafayette and John Hancock came, and Paul Revere as well. Sullivan learned that during the siege that Henry Clinton in New York was gathering a large fleet with 5,000 troops, and he was going to bring them to Newport up Narragansett Bay. He's going to cut off the retreat off the island of Sullivan's army, and that would have been a disaster for Sullivan's army. So Sullivan says, well, I better retreat from Middletown, where the siege was occurring, to the northern part of the island. Butts Hill Fort was the defensive line from east to west. And he said, if they show up, we can easily get off at Howland's Ferry into Tiverton. Or if the French fleet shows up, their boats are fixed, we can stay where we are. So the next morning, General Piggott decided to attack, hoping to catch the army in the midst of removing his troops. That would have been a very vulnerable time for the American army. He sends 1,100 British regulars up the East Main Road today, and about 1,800 German and Loyalist regulars up West Main Road. So you can see the East Road is, West is on the left and East is on the right. The Americans have some troops that are advance guards. So there are several hundred troops. They're not intended to defeat the British, but they're intended just to rattle them, slow them down, make them tired, So when they get to the main American lines at the top there, they'll be worn out. But what happens is, what now is the Portsmouth Historical Society, I'll be speaking there next week, a small advanced unit of Massachusetts state troops and Rhode Islanders hiding behind a stone wall suddenly spring up and they fire 2 volleys into the 22nd British Regiment, one of their best regiments. And this was one of the best ambushes the Americans made in the war. American advanced troops also put up strong resistance to the north at Quaker Hill, but the advanced troops were eventually overwhelmed by oncoming British troops who outnumbered them. So they retreat to the main American lines on the east side of the island, commanded by John Glover of Marblehead, Massachusetts. Picket soldiers marched up to the defensive positions, and now he has to decide, do we attack the Americans? They're all behind stone walls, very well defended, a lot of stone walls up there. He remembers, he was at Bunker Hill, he remembered it, and he said, no, we don't want to do that. So the action on the east side stopped. Meanwhile, on the West Road, a small party of advanced troops led by Lieutenant John Lawrence of South Carolina, you might remember him from the Broadway show. He was taking care of some advanced troops on the east side, and there were several engagements that he was in, and he held up the Loyalist and German troops on that side, but finally had to retreat back to the main lines. And at the main line, there was a redoubt in the middle of the road. It was held by the 2nd Rhode Island Regiment. So that regiment was all white troops. And then next to it, on a stone wall supporting them, was the 1st Rhode Island Regiment of Continentals. That was a new regiment formed between February and June of 1778, mostly of formerly enslaved black men who had obtained their freedom by enlisting in the regiment for the duration of the war. The regiment had free men of color, blacks, Indians, mostly Narragansetts from Charlestown, and those of mixed race. Many of them had already served, about 36 of the, there were about 175 soldiers of color, and about 38 of them had served in 1777 at major battles in the South, and they helped to win a major victory at what's called the defense of Fort Mercer at Red Bank. So this was the only segregated regiment on either side of the war during the Revolutionary War. So this is on the east side, again, a lot of action. At one point, the Americans charged a British artillery cannon. They seized it, and then the British counterattacked and took it back, and it was pretty fierce. Go ahead. Here's the black regiment. The image on the left is pretty famous, held up at the John Carter Brown Library. And I took this photo of a mannequin of a black soldier that's at the U.S. National Army Museum in Washington, D.C. They did a nice job with that. So despite the fact that these recently emancipated men, it was their first battle, they were never allowed to pick up muskets when they were enslaved. 3 times the German and Loyalist troops tried to storm the American lines, and each time they were driven back. Also, of course, they were the Narragansetts who served. These are Stockbridge Indians, very similar to what the Narragansetts would have looked like. And the main reservation, Narragansett Reservation, was in Charlestown. So here's the action on the west side. You can see the redoubt there. So the last attempt in particular, the troops actually went beyond the redoubt, the enemy troops. Nathaniel Greene then feeds in 2 regiments at a crucial time, and they charge the Germans. The Germans are getting fired at from all sides, not just from the Rhode Island Regiment, but from about 1,500 troops in total. And they just skedaddle. They retreat, they leave their dead and wounded on the field. So the battle is over. The Americans had fought effectively against German, British, and Loyalist regulars. And the British Army suffered more casualties, 260 to 231. The night after the battle, Sullivan's army successfully retreated off of Aquidneck Island. So you can see this map that was contemporaneous. On the lower right, these are the boats, small boats taking off the American soldiers in the nighttime. It was a very successful operation. They say nobody was left on the island. Well, I did find one guy who fell asleep, but he was captured, but he was exchanged about a month later. So the Rhode Island campaign was a failure. They didn't succeed in taking Newport, so that was a bummer. But the Americans, at least, could be pleased with the performance of its army. You know, they received really good training at Valley Forge, and they were, effectively performed in the Battle of Rhode Island. Even the militia, Massachusetts militia, got in the action. Rhode Island militia did not get in the action, but they were there just in case. So the remaining portion of the British occupation of Quidnick Island and Jamestown from September 1778 to October 1779 was not as eventful as the first part. They were always feared more raids, and so they would occasionally draft militia to patrol, to gather and protect against potential raids or patrol the coastline. But the British never did venture out with a large force. Still, there was one raid in particular. There was a small Tory fleet operating out of Newport, led by George Leonard of Plymouth, Massachusetts, and he would make raids onto North Kingstown and South Kingstown, Narragansett farms. He'd take people at night and that kind of thing. He actually did stage a raid during the fog, and a company of black soldiers from the 1st Rhode Island were surprised, and 11 of them were captured. So that was one of the regiment's worst days. That was from Quidnesset in North Kingstown. About 6 months later, 5 of them were able to escape and return to the regiment. So spying activities were engaged in by both sides, and there was one spy called Metcalf Bowler. He was a wealthy merchant. He had his house in Portsmouth in one of the finest gardens in New England. He served as Speaker of the House in the General Assembly during the days around Lexington and Concord. He was considered a patriot. Here's Jonathan Copley of Boston, created this portrait of his wife in a very elegant dress, as you can see. But after the Rhode Island campaign, he became a spy for the British. So he was our Benedict Arnold. No one found out about it until about 100 years after the war. Now, during the Rhode Island campaign, when there was the siege, the British really wanted the information. How many troops are there? When are they going to attack us? Where are they going to attack us? They didn't have any spies, so they were very frustrated. So what they would do was they would capture citizens, just private citizens, like, they captured a 20-year-old woman. Tell us all you know. Say, well, Sullivan has about 8,000 troops. D'Estaing has 6,000 troops. They're going to attack on different sides of the island. Then they're going to meet up, and then they're going to attack you in Newport. All very extremely accurate. Wow! So it just goes to show you that how rumors spread so quickly. Jamestown wasn't, of course, it was an island. It wasn't even. I don't know how the information got there, but that's an effective way to get information. There was one important Patriot spy whose name was Isaac Barker, and he lived about 1 mile from Woods Castle in Middletown. So he was near the coast of the cross of the Sakonnet River, and he would send signals to a Lieutenant Seth Chapin. Is that coming through some kind of speaker or something? Or is that? Okay.
It's coming from the fire station.
Ship's on fire.
We're okay here, I think, so that's good. So anyway, he would have a spy. He was spying on the British in Newport. Then he would put messages in this rock formation on the Sakonnet River. Woods Castle, it was called. And this Lieutenant Chapin would row across from Little Compton at night, pick it up, go back. And General Sullivan once wrote a letter to Samuel Adams in Boston praising this spy's reports. I came across like 38 different reports that he wrote. So you can see he would go across to the Sakonnet River here. That's where he would put the spy messages in that rock formation. Now he applied for a pension, but it was rejected. And I'm glad he did apply because he told all about his activities, and that's how we learned about most of it. The reason he was rejected was he was never enlisted in an official regiment. He was just a spy. Yeah, the General Assembly should have helped him out, but they never did. So Clinton feared another attack in October of 1779 by D'Estaing. D'Estaing had sailed away to the Caribbean. Now he was coming back. And Clinton ordered that Newport should be evacuated. It was affected in October of 1779. The British, to their credit, didn't burn or loot Newport. They did burn Beavertail Lighthouse. But they did, for 3 years. There was really cold winters. The British didn't have enough firewood to keep them warm or for fires to cook their food. So they tore down a lot of houses of patriots. Hundreds of houses were destroyed. And trees, orchards were torn down. In many ways, Newport never recovered. The departing ships included a lot of loyalists, these who supported the crown and wanted the crown to continue to rule the colonies. Many of them had been Rhode Islanders for generations, from the 1600s. They also included some Rhode Islanders of color. More than 600 Rhode Island black and other men of color served in Continental State militia regiments, and 135 men that I found have gained their freedom by enlisting in the 1st Rhode Island. In comparison, about 24 enslaved men, women, and children adopted a different route. They either escaped to Newport to join the British or were there already and departed on British ships for New York City. So they gained their freedom that way. So now we get to the 4th and final stage. The French occupied Newport from July 1780 to August 1781. So it was another occupation, but a friendly one by an ally. On July 10, 1780, a French fleet carrying some 6,000 French soldiers, commanded by Lieutenant General Comte de Rochambeau, arrived off Newport. Rochambeau intended to use Newport as the primary French base of operations in the United States. So here's Rochambeau. The troops are landing on the main wharf, Long Wharf in Newport. Meanwhile, Clinton said, well, it's going to take a while for the French to establish their defenses, so I could send, a Navy can carry soldiers and we can attack Newport before their defenses get established. And he actually made that plan. But Patriot spies, including some working for the famous Culper spy ring that I talk about in my Rhode Island Spies book, alerted Rochambeau to the gathering expedition. The Rhode Island Assembly drafts a lot more troops, including some from Charlestown, and they gather in Quinnipiac Island to help defend against an attack. But Clinton never did mount an attack. He had problems with the commander of the British Navy, and so he never was able to do it. This is the right. You see another beautiful French map. They're firing lines. They have artillery on Rose Island and where Fort Adams is, and Goat Island, in case the British try to attack. Plus, they have their own ships there firing. On the left is a loyalist spy information that was sent by, his guy's name was Hazard, an important name in southern Rhode Island. And he sent it to General Clinton, telling him about the French defenses. So General Washington traveled to Newport in March of 1781 to meet with Rochambeau. He went through Kingston, and then he went to South Ferry, crossed over to Jamestown. He meets with Rochambeau, the French admirals and officers. Washington was greeted in Newport by artillery salute as he stepped off the ferry on March 6th. French troops lined both sides of the road to Rochambeau's headquarters. Newport political leaders were so excited about Washington's visit, they handed out free candles for everyone to put in their windows at night. And if you didn't put a candle in your window, it meant you were a Tory, and then you got your windows broken. So. That's the Vernon House that stands today at Clark and Mary Streets. That's where Rochambeau's headquarters were. And of course, that's Washington. The French occupation of Newport was complicated. The Newporters, of course, the French were allies. They appreciated that. They also had hard money. They really appreciated that. But you had 6,000 troops that all competing for food, and there wasn't a huge amount of food, so that resulted in inflation. We know Americans do not like inflation. So in June of 1781, Rochambeau marched most of his troops in 2 divisions to the southward, ultimately ended up at Yorktown, Virginia, and trapped the British Army there and won the war. Most of the troops first embarked on French ships that landed in Providence, where they encamped June 12th to June 22nd. Then they marched across the state and then met up with Washington's army at White Plains, and then they marched down to Yorktown. On August 23rd, Admiral Barras in Newport and 9 ships departed Newport with his artillery train. So you couldn't do a siege of Yorktown without artillery. Admiral Barras in Newport had that artillery on these ships, along with 480 French infantrymen and 130 artillerists. A contingent of 104 French infantrymen went to Newport, from Newport to Providence to protect that city. Thus, the French had fully evacuated Newport. Meanwhile, more Rhode Island militia were called out to protect Quinnipiac Island and Newport. As I said, as a result of this, the British Army at Yorktown was forced to surrender in October of 1781. That surrender eventually led to the end of the war and victory by the Americans, and they were able to have its Declaration of Independence become true. But that took more than a year to get those negotiations finished. The Congress did not ratify the Treaty of Paris that ended the war until May of 1784. Really, it ended in 1783. Meanwhile, the Council of War continued until April 24, 1782, making sure that troops were supplied in the field. And the French army returned from Yorktown on a march to Boston, where the French ships picked them up, took them back to France, and they encamped in Providence in November 1782. I'm going to talk a little bit about soldiers of color from Charlestown, the 1st Rhode Island. Because the Narragansett reservation was in Charlestown, they supplied a lot of troops. And you can see 28 full-blooded Indians, 2 of black and Indian heritage, 1 of black and white, and only 1 black soldier. So 32. 16 of them, 50%, died during the war. So that was the death rate. There was an awful death rate for soldiers in the war, and in particular, I think because they were Indians with less of a protections against European diseases, they didn't fare as well. Valley Forge, 3 died. At the siege of Yorktown afterwards, all these soldiers were together. They weren't getting great food. They were crammed together. Illnesses spread, and 7 of them from Charleston died. So a lot of sacrifice there. The role of women. Women were not permitted to fight in the war, of course, but they found many other ways to contribute to the Patriot cause. For example, in October 1779, General Assembly and then issued a broadside saying that 3,000 pairs of good yard stockings would be purchased by the government from most Rhode Island towns. So each Rhode Island town had its quota to fulfill. Women would be expected to make the socks for the army. And Charleston's quota was 84 pairs of stockings. So. Joseph Stanton Jr. of Charlestown, he was the most prominent Charlestown patriot. He was born in the Wilcox Tavern, 1739. He was a successful farmer, but unlike his father, he never used enslaved people. He was appointed colonel of the 1st Rhode Island State Regiment for 16 months, starting in December of 1776. He served as a member of the Rhode Island Council of War from 1780 to 1781. Remember, I told you that pretty much ran the war for Rhode Island. He was elected general of the state's militia in 1788, and he served until 1791. After the war, he was the leader of the Country Party in Rhode Island, one of the leaders. The Country Party didn't want to join the Constitution. They didn't want Rhode Island to join the Constitution. They wanted to keep it out. They were issuing paper money. These guys were mostly farmers. They had a lot of debts. They wanted Rhode Island to issue paper money, which they elected guys who did that. And Joseph Stanton was one of their leaders. And one guy said, the paper money is going to be as good as gold. Well, it fell to about 10% of the value of the gold. So if you're a creditor, you didn't like that very much, but actually it worked pretty well for Rhode Islanders. It avoided Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts. In western Massachusetts, there was actually a rebellion by farmers there who lost their farms. So once the debts were paid off, Rhode Island finally, all right, we'll join the Union. They were threatened with being dismembered by Connecticut and Massachusetts. So they joined the Union in 1790. And when they joined the Union, Joseph Stanton was elected selected as one of the first 2 senators from Rhode Island. So he served from 1790 to 1793. He was also elected to the House of Representatives from 1801 to 1807. You can see the memorial that you probably passed many times. This is what it says. It focuses on that he was the U.S. Senator from 1790 to 93 and House of Representatives from 1801 to 1807. Doesn't mention his Revolutionary War service. You remember Barton's raid that captured Prescott. He was Barton's commander, and he approved the raid and really encouraged Prescott to move forward with it. So Stanton inherited the Wilcox Tavern, but he had financial difficulties and had to sell it in 1811, 10 years before his death. So that ends my formal presentation. If you're interested afterwards, I am selling these books for $20 each, much less than you buy them on Amazon. These are 2 of the Revolutionary War books that I've talked about. Go to the next one, please. And Dark Voyage, Spies. I only have 1 Spies book here with me left. And then next one, I also have 2 World War II books that I wrote and I was talking about the last time I was here. My latest book is Machine Guns in Narragansett Bay. It's about rum runners getting fired at by the Coast Guard. Thank you very much.